Isolationism. Isolationism is a political ideology that advocates for a country to remain neutral and avoid involvement in foreign affairs or conflicts. It was particularly appealing to Americans in the 1920s and 1930s due to a variety of factors. One reason for the popularity of isolationism during this time period was the devastating impact of World War I on American society. The war had taken a toll on the country's economy and had resulted in the loss of many American lives. As a result, many Americans were hesitant to become involved in another international conflict. Another factor that contributed to the appeal of isolationism was the rise of nationalism and nativism. Many Americans believed that the country should focus on its own affairs and prioritize the interests of its citizens over those of other nations. Additionally, the Great Depression of the 1930s heightened the appeal of isolationism. As the country faced economic hardship, the high levels of unemployment, many Americans believed that resources should be focused on domestic issues rather than foreign affairs. Isolationism was further reinforced by legislation such as the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, which were designed to prevent the United States from becoming involved in future conflicts. These laws prohibited American citizens from selling or transporting arms to countries at war and made it difficult for the country to provide aid to European nations during the lead-up to World War II. The later establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was an example that America was departing from the traditional policy of isolationism. World War II. Domestic discontent and bitterness over Germany's loss of World War I were the main contributions to Hitler's rise in power. In the 1930s, Germany, Italy, and Japan were expanding their territories through aggressive military actions. They invaded and conquered neighboring countries, which raised concerns in the United States about their intentions and the potential threat they posed to American interests. Despite these concerns, many Americans were hesitant to become involved in another international conflict. The country's neutrality and isolationist policies were reinforced by legislation such as the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, which prohibited the United States from providing aid or support to nations at war. But in December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing over 2,000 Americans and destroying much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack was the final straw that pushed the United States into war. This is also why, in an attempt to end the war, President Truman sent an atomic bomb on the Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Truman bombed Hiroshima 3 days before Nagasaki because Hiroshima was experiencing better weather. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. Roosevelt was born into a wealthy New York family. He left law school to pursue a political career. He served in the New York legislature and as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His bout with polio gave him an understanding of human suffering and a broad political appeal. He re-entered politics and was elected governor of New York in 1928. Throughout the 1930s, President Roosevelt sought to balance American neutrality and isolationism with a desire to support Britain and other allied nations. He provided economic and military aid to these countries through programs such as Lend-Lease, which allowed the U.S. to provide supplies and equipment to the Allies without entering the war directly. President Roosevelt also promised to create a second front in Europe by the end of 1942 in order to keep the Soviet Union in the war. Roosevelt also created 14 points, but England and France were reluctant to embrace them because they had suffered terribly during the war and wanted Germany to be crippled. As events unfolded and the threat of Axis powers became more apparent, public opinion in the United States began to shift toward support for involvement in the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized public opinion and led to a surge in enlistments and support for the war effort. World War II in the Pacific Theater had a significant impact on the United States, both internationally and domestically. Here is a brief overview of how the war affected the country internationally and domestically. Internationally, expansion of American influence. The United States emerged from World War II as a superpower and a dominant force on the world stage. The war in the Pacific allowed the U.S. to expand its influence in the region and establish military and economic alliances with key partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Shifting global power dynamics. The war also reshaped global power dynamics, with the U.S. and the Soviet Union emerging as the two dominant superpowers. This led to the Cold War and a decades-long struggle for global influence between the two nations. International institutions. The war led to the creation of several international institutions designed to promote peace and cooperation among nations, including the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. Domestically, economic growth and industrialization. The U.S. economy boomed during World War II, fueled by massive government spending on the war effort. The war led to the expansion of American industry, increased production of goods, and job growth. Social change. The war also led to significant social changes in the United States. Women entered the workforce in large numbers to fill jobs left vacant by men serving in the military, and African Americans and other minority groups made gains in the fight for civil rights. Military technology and innovation. The war spurred significant advancements in military technology and innovation. With the U.S. developing new weapons and tactics to gain an advantage over its enemies, in 1947, the United States established the National Security Act of 1947. This established the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. Human cost. The war had a significant human cost, with over 400,000 Americans losing their lives in the conflict. The war also led to the internment of Japanese Americans in concentration camps, a dark moment in American history. The American economy also experienced significant changes after World War II, as the country shifted from a wartime economy to a peacetime one. Here are some key ways in which the American economy evolved during this period. Expansion of industry. The U.S. economy experienced a post-war boom, with the manufacturing sector expanding rapidly to meet the growing demand for consumer goods. Industries such as automobiles, electronics, and housing saw significant growth during this time. Increase in consumerism. With the expansion of industry, consumerism also increased. Americans had more disposable income and were able to purchase more goods than ever before. This trend was fueled by advertising and marketing campaigns that promoted consumer goods. Rise of service industry. While the manufacturing sector saw significant growth after the war, the service industry also emerged as a major player in the American economy. Service jobs such as healthcare, education, and retail began to make up a larger portion of the workforce. Technological advancements. The post-war period also saw significant technological advancements with the development of new technologies such as computers, telecommunications, and space exploration. These advancements paved the way for further economic growth and innovation. Global economic integration. The U.S. economy also became increasingly integrated with the global economy during this period. The country became a major player in international trade, and multinational corporations began to have a significant impact on the American economy. The culture of the United States underwent significant changes after World War II, as the country emerged from a period of intense global conflict and entered a new era of prosperity and innovation. Here are some key ways in which American culture changed during this time. Rise of youth culture. The post-war period saw the emergence of a new youth culture, with teenagers becoming an increasingly important demographic in American society. This was fueled by the growth of rock and roll music, the popularity of movies and television shows aimed at young people, and the rise of consumer culture. Increased diversity. The post-war period saw significant changes in terms of diversity and inclusion in American culture. The Civil Rights Movement brought attention to issues of racial inequality, leading to changes in laws and attitudes towards people of color. The feminist movement also gained momentum during this time, leading to changes in gender roles and expectations. Technological advancements. The post-war period also saw significant technological advancements, with new technologies such as television, automobiles, and airplanes becoming more widely available. These innovations had a major impact on American culture, transforming the way people lived, worked, and interacted with each other. Changes in art and literature. The post-war period also saw changes in American art and literature, with new movements such as abstract expressionism and the Beat generation emerging. These movements challenged traditional ideas about art and literature and explored new themes and styles. Abstract expressionism also emphasized individuality and freedom from the constraints of representational, realistic art. Shift in political and social attitudes. The post-war period saw a shift in political and social attitudes in America, with a growing sense of optimism and confidence about the future. This was fueled by the country's economic growth and leadership role in the world, as well as the development of new technologies and cultural movements. During this time, Robert Lansing replaced William Jennings Bryan as Secretary of State, which favored the Allies. The Cold War. The Cold War was a period of political and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from the end of World War II until the early 1990s. How the Cold War began. Ideological differences. The Cold War began primarily as a result of ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a communist country, while the United States was a capitalist democracy. The two countries had fundamentally different ideas about government, economics, and individual freedoms. Post-World War II tensions. Tensions between the two countries increased after World War II when the Soviet Union began to expand its influence into Eastern Europe. American policymakers believed that Western Europe was open to the Soviet penetration because they were still struggling from the aftermath of the war. Because of this, they adopted a policy of containment to limit Soviet influence. Arms race and proxy wars. The Cold War was also characterized by an arms race, with both countries developing increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. The two sides also engaged in proxy wars in countries such as Korea and Vietnam, supporting opposing sides in conflicts around the world. How the Cold War affected life in America. Domestic politics. The Cold War had a significant impact on American politics, with issues related to communism in the Soviet Union playing a major role in national elections. The fear of communism led to the rise of McCarthyism, a period of political repression and persecution of suspected communists in the United States. The Red Scare. Citizens at this time had such a fear of communism that the House of Un-American Activities Committee held meetings saying that communist agendas had invaded the Agriculture and Treasury Department in early 1930s. President Truman also initiated a loyalty program in 1947, ordering security checks on government employees to find any hidden communists. In 4 years, thousands of workers lost their jobs on the grounds of guilty by association. Algar Hiss was accused of being a Soviet spy, but convicted only of perjury because the statute of limitations prevented a charge of treason. 11 officials of the Communist Party were charged with advocating the violent overthrow of the government, found guilty by a jury, and given prison sentences and heavy fines. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were found guilty of espionage for conspiring to transmit atomic secrets to the Soviet Union and executed. Military spending. The Cold War led to significant increases in military spending, with the United States and the Soviet Union competing to develop more powerful weapons and technology. This spending had both positive and negative impacts on the American economy. An example of this is the Truman Doctrine, which is when President Truman asked the United States government for $400 million to send to Turkey and Greece to help them fight against communism in their countries, and was a justification that President Reagan used to explain a large increase in military spending. Culture and entertainment. The Cold War influenced American culture and entertainment with movies, television shows, and books often featuring themes related to communism and the threat of nuclear war. International relations. The Cold War had a major impact on American foreign policy, with the U.S. engaged in a global struggle for influence and power with the Soviet Union. This led to the development of alliances and partnerships with other countries, for example, NATO, which is where the United States committed itself to deploying troops in Europe as well as international crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Political. In the election of 1952, the three key issues that were raised by Republicans were communism, corruption, and Korea. This emphasizes the fear of communism in America at this time. The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement in the United States was a social and political movement that sought to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans and other minorities. Here is an overview of how the movement developed and progressed from the mid-1950s through the late 1970s. Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, according to the 14th Amendment. This decision laid the groundwork for future legal challenges to segregation and discrimination. Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama organized a boycott of the city's buses to protest segregation on public transportation. The boycott, which lasted for over a year, was a major success and helped to spark a national conversation about civil rights. Critics of consumer culture. The Beats were a literary group that rebelled against 1950s materialism. Beat works included Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road and Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl. Flouting the respectability of suburbia and conventional society norms, the Beatniks led lives that included long hair, bizarre clothing, and a penchant for sexual promiscuity and drugs. In the art world, abstract expressionists expressed individuality and freedom as opposed to representational realistic art. Painters such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko challenged mainstream America's notion of the form and function of art. Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public places, schools, and the workplace. Voting Rights Act of 1965. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote, such as the literacy test, a test given to potential voters to make sure that they could read and write, the grandfather clause, stating that if your ancestors could vote, you did not need to take the literacy test, and a poll tax. March on Washington. In 1963, civil rights leaders organized a massive march on Washington, D.C., to call for an end to racial discrimination and to demand greater civil rights protections for African Americans. Black Power Movement. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Black Power movement emerged as a more militant and radical approach to civil rights activism. This movement emphasized self-determination, Black pride, and the need for African Americans to control their own communities and destinies. Affirmative action. In the 1970s, the concept of affirmative action gained prominence as a means of addressing past discrimination and promoting greater diversity in employment and education.